Here are some tips for knitting in brioche stitch in the round. So I'm working on this hat. This is a hat pattern that I made called the Warmest Hat. It's really warm because brioche stitch is very warm. And a couple of things I just want to point out about brioche stitch if you're not used to working in it. And even if you are, this might be helpful. It was helpful to me to kind of reframe this. So brioche stitch is essentially ribbing with your knit stitches, and then your purl stitches have these yarn overs with them. And the way to think about brioche is in a set of 2 stitches. So you have your knit stitches and your purl stitches. And one of those is always going to have a yarn over associated with it. So if you know anything about brioche, it's a series of slipping, yarn over, and then working the next stitch. And when you're working in the round, you do a knit based row and then a purl based row. And so I have a few tips about that, because what happens is it can get a little bit confusing at the end of your round and at the end of wherever you're moving your cable if you work like I do on a magic loop. So I wanted to go over just a couple things about that. So I'm starting on a knit row right here. And the first thing I like to keep in mind is that I'm going to think of the yarn over as just completely married to the slip stitch that I'm going to do. So since I'm on a knit row, and with brioche, if you're doing knit or purl brioche, you're always going to work your stitch into the stitch that has the yarn over next to it. So this is a stitch and yarn over pair, and I'm knitting into this, and that's a brioche knit. And then I go yarn front, slip the next stitch, and then make sure the yarn is over the needle, brioche knit into the next stitch. So this is my basic brioche knitting pattern. And so now that slip stitch is always with the yarn over. That's what I mean as you're working. If you think of the slip stitch as always being with the yarn over, it's really helpful to go around the bend of your cable or at the beginning of a row. So I'm going to continue going through this row here, and then I'll show you what I do at the end. All right, so now I'm at the end of this section before my magic loop. And what is really helpful to me is to always end a break of a section like this in the same pattern that I'm working on. And what I mean by that is I'm starting with the knit and at the beginning of this round, and then, so I want to end with a purl. And I want that to echo the end of my round. So I know at the end of this round is a purl stitch, and so I want the end of the row to be like that. So how that works and why it's helpful is because as we finish here, I'll do the yarn in front, slip and yarn over. Because I always know that the slip stitch and the yarn over are married, I'm going to keep this on this needle as I switch to move along. And that's going to help me because sometimes it can get confusing what to do with the yarn over when you're working on a magic loop or just working in the round. So now I'm ready to continue. Here's my slip stitch, and I'm going to keep the yarn over here on this needle. So I already did my yarn over. Now I'm ready to continue, and I'm not going to start with the yarn over on this side because I'm starting with the knit and I have my yarn over on the back. And I'm going to do the same thing at the end of this round and show you how to work in the round with brioche, because at the end of the round, it's a little weird because you basically will have a yarn over at the end, and then you want to start the next round with a yarn over as well because you start with a slip stitch. So I'm at the end of my knit round, and I'll do my final brioche knit, yarn in front, slip, and yarn over. And now when you're working in the round, you always do a knit row and then a purl row. So I'm going to move into the purl row. And like we just did when we switched the cable, we want that yarn over to be on the back needle. But now we're also going to start with a yarn over on the front needle for the beginning of our purl row, because since we're doing a purl, we're going to slip the knit stitch and purl into the purl stitch. So what that looks like is you just have your yarn over on the end here, on the end of your round, and then you're also going to create a yarn over to slip that stitch. And I remember this as when I'm in the middle of a series, meaning a knit row, a knit round, and then a purl round, I consider that kind of a series. In the middle of that series, I do the yarn over thing. And then at the end of the series, I put a period on it and the yarn over doesn't come into play, which I'll show you. I don't know if that's confusing, but that's how I think about it. So we've got the yarn in the front. We're going to slip this stitch, do the yarn over and the brioche purl, and then we're going to keep going like that. And seriously, as long as you remember that the slip stitch and the yarn over are married as you go along, and just really think of them as one stitch, it really helps to not get confused about what to do with the yarn overs at the end of the beginning of the rounds and when you're switching your cables. Okay, so on this purl row, I'm about to move my cable. So I'm ending with a brioche purl. And since I just worked into that stitch, it's not a slip stitch, so I'm not going to do a yarn over there. And flipping it over and moving my cable around. Now I do have a slip stitch because that's the next stitch, and I will for sure do a yarn over. Now I'm at the end of my brioche purl row. And so I do my final brioche purl. And then I want to make sure to put the yarn in the back. This is the only kind of time when you sort of break the pattern, but this is what I meant by putting a period on it. Like, okay, period. That series is done. I'm going to start over with a new series of brioche knit and brioche purl row. And the yarn is in the back, and I'm ready to start again. And there's just no yarn overs here because we worked into that brioche purl stitch to end, and we're going to work into this new brioche knit stitch to start. And so there just is not a yarn over. And that is how you do it. Another way to think of it is usually the brioche purl rows will be the even number rounds. And so I always just make sure to put a period on it after the end of even number rounds. But it's just helpful to have different ways of thinking about it. And by the way, this is totally different than knitting brioche back and forth in rows. We only do this brioche knit and brioche purl thing in the round. It's like stockinette stitch, where when you're working stockinette stitch back and forth, you do a row of knit and then a row of purl. It's kind of the opposite of that with brioche, where when you're working brioche straight in rows, you just work the brioche knit pattern. And when you're working in the round, you do the brioche knit pattern and the brioche purl pattern. I hope that wasn't too confusing, and I hope these brioche tips serve you well to have your beautiful brioche knits. It's just such a freaking beautiful stitch. I absolutely love it. And it's my favorite for variegated yarn. I love how this is turning out.